Great, Peter. I think you can kick off now. I think everybody's here.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Peter Kiley, one of the partners here at Kiley Thompson Caisley. Thank you very much for attending the seminar on the Holidays Act, a complex area of the law, unfortunately, and many of you will have been involved in audits and claims under the Holidays Act. What is exciting, and I hope it is exciting, is that the government has announced it intends to review and fix the Holidays Act. Let's see, I hope so. And what the government has done through the Ministry of Business, Employment and Innovation is set up a consultation process. And this is where you fit in as clients and people with an interest in the Holidays Act. So what we're going to do today is to point out some of the areas where there are issues and what the government might be looking at. We've been following it very carefully. I know Business New Zealand, for example, is very keen on an accrual type system, but there are other areas of it, and there's interesting case law developing too. So what we're going to do today is just to point out some of the issues and some of the possible proposed changes. And what we want you to do is to give feedback either to us, because we're in close consultation with the Chamber of Commerce and Business New Zealand, or you can do it directly, or you can do it through us. Entirely over to you. But no one knows more about the Holidays Act than the people who try to interpret it and apply it. So two speakers today, two of my colleagues, Scott Worthy, very bright guy, former judge's clerk, and Scott's appeared in many of the key cases. Scott and I appeared for Business New Zealand in the Metropolitan Glass bonus case. And Scott will present in conjunction with Hannah King, who will be known to many of you. Hannah rejoined the firm last month, and we're just thrilled about that because she's so hardworking, so practical, so articulate. And she's regularly advised on Holiday Act issues, particularly Labour Inspector investigations. So welcome, Scott and Hannah, and I happily pass over to you.
Thanks, Peter.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for that introduction. And of course, Peter left out that he's a bit of an expert in the Holidays Act himself, having written the leading textbook in New Zealand on the Holidays Act, which may well need to be pretty much updated shortly. As Peter said, I'm Scott, one of the partners here, and I wanted to let you know that if you've got any Q&A questions, you can use the Q&A function to type in those questions throughout the seminar, and hopefully we'll have time at the end to get back to some of those questions. Ikra Khan, one of our solicitors here, we're monitoring that, and Ikra was also involved today in preparing these slides and preparing the summary that we're going to give you today. If we look at what we're going to cover today, the outline of what we're going to do, we're going to talk a little bit about the problem. A lot of you will be aware of the problem, but it's useful to think about how we got here and why we're here with the Holidays Act, which isn't actually something that works really well for a lot of people. We're going to talk about the new government's approach, which is a bit different than the previous government's view on the world. We'll take you through some of those changes, in particular annual leave, what's now known as FBAPS leave, family violence, bereavement, alternative holidays, public holidays, and sick leave. It's all the other types of leave that's not annual leave. We'll talk a little bit about the timeline that might work for this, although we're still in the early stages of it, and some key takeaways at the end as well. So if we think about what the problem is, the basic problem is the Holidays Act isn't, and hasn't been for quite a while, fit for its purpose. Its purpose obviously is to provide leave to employees in a way that makes sense, is easy to administer, and ensures that both employers get it right and employees receive the correct amount of leave and the correct payment for that leave. Unfortunately, many people haven't been doing this correctly for some time, and that's not really the fault of lack of effort. Employers in particular have put mountains of effort into getting the Holidays Act right, but within the Act there are calculations, requirements, obligations which are uncertain, are subjective, and are complicated, and so they're ripe for getting wrong. And as many employers know, you're only told it's wrong much later when the labour inspector comes or when an employee raises a claim, and then you look back and you find out that despite your best efforts, something went wrong. The Act is based, although it's called the Holidays Act 2003, it's actually based on an Act that was passed in 1944. It's been updated since then, obviously. There have been some updates, but it fundamentally works on the basis of there are two types of employee: a waged employee who works in a factory or something like that, and who works hours and maybe has overtime and has days off where they don't come into work, and it's a very simple structure. Or there's a 9-to-5 salaried employee who works Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, and is paid a salary. If you're one of those employees, the Act works okay, but that's not reflective of real life now in the many ways people work. Casual employees, part-time employees, employees with variable hours at work, employees with rotating roster systems, part-time employees who may work for 3 different employers in the same period. Put simply, it doesn't capture the way that we work now for many New Zealanders. The consequence of all of that is that there have been unpaid entitlements. Leave has been recorded incorrectly. People have been underpaid for their leave. Now, again, that's not because employers have been embarked on a scheme or a plan to minimize entitlements, but because of the uncertainties, the complications, employers who have tried to get it right sometimes haven't. And as many of you will be aware, that includes government employees. The Ministry of Justice, almost all the ministries got this wrong. Lots of big employers got it wrong. Lots of small employers got it wrong. And as a result, billions of dollars have had to be reorganized, repaid, remediated to fix this issue. And there was a big focus on this between 2015 and 2020 when the Labour Inspector and MB were really focused on ensuring compliance. So everyone, I think, accepts there's a big problem. The next step is, well, what do we do about it? The previous government put in place a Holidays Act Taskforce. It's a tripartite task force, i.e. it involved the government, the unions, and business, in particular Business New Zealand. The baseline of that approach, though, was that basically no one could be worse off. So although the aim was to simplify things, clarify things, make calculations easier, ensure that leave is more accurately recorded, avoid people being underpaid, the baseline assumption that the government worked on and the task force worked on was that no one could be worse off. And if you begin with that assumption, then that adds layers of complexity back in. So, for instance, there were under the task force's approach, additional calculations had to be made, additional procedures were put in place to ensure compliance, which didn't necessarily simplify things and didn't necessarily lead to a easier to understand and implement system. Before the last election, the government paused this work. So it got so far, but there wasn't a bill ready to go, and there was still much work to be done. So at that point, the government paused it, and of course, the government changed.
So what we have now is the ministry looking to introduce a new bill. It is going to introduce what I presume will still be called the Holidays Act, but a new piece of legislation. This is not going to be a complete overhaul, the sort of thing that you might have expected under the previous, under the outcomes that the task force had given us. What we understand will happen is that the underlying entitlements model will stay the same, essentially, and proposed changes will broadly align with the current drafting. Things that aren't going to be changed will remain the same in the new act. So not a completely new piece of legislation, but many changes nevertheless, and we'll talk through some of those key ones today. The government believes that there are opportunities to simplify the legislation while still maintaining that overall level of entitlement. And I say overall because there are some trade-offs. It seems that the ministry here is looking to strike a bit of a balance. It's been acknowledged in the ministry's cabinet paper that everybody could go further. We could simplify further and make more foundational changes, and that may be what many businesses are calling for, but that would require a real trade-off in terms of policy objectives and a much greater lead in time in terms of needing to run through the policy design process again. And then if something like that does get through, there would be much greater change for payroll providers and employers to deal with. So what I see happening here, what's being proposed, is somewhat of a compromise. And what the ministry has said is that the proposed changes are designed to allow a faster progress, really, towards greater simplicity for employers, and obviously, hopefully, therefore, greater outcomes for employees as well, and more certainty for everybody involved. I will talk later in our session today about the intended process for consultation on the bill, because that is a little bit different to what we normally see. But for now, I want to look at one of the key areas of change, and that is, as you would expect, to annual leave. So I will look at this in two parts. What entitlements will look like and what payments will be. Although what you will understand once I've finished is that we have more intel on what entitlement is going to look like than what payments will really look like. So the proposal that we're seeing from the ministry now focuses on the way, very much on the way that employees earn and take annual leave. And one of the key changes, probably the biggest change, is that there will be a move from the current system of entitlement to an accrual system. And what I mean by that is that, as most of you on this call will be very aware, under our current system in New Zealand, we've got an entitlement system. So the statutory minimum provides that after 12 months of employment, an employee becomes entitled to their statutory minimum entitlement of annual holidays. That differs from many comparable jurisdictions, notably the UK and and our Australian friends as well. And what that has meant is that, particularly here in New Zealand, our payroll systems, almost all of them are set up to work on an accrual system, because it's often Australian software that's been New Zealandized. And the government, I think, has really picked up on this. There's been a lot of engagement with payroll practitioners in particular, and they've said, well, look, what is sensible here is that we look towards a new approach of accrual. So that means that what is being proposed is that there's going to be a system whereby an employee accrues their 4-week annual holidays entitlement from the date they start their job. And quite clearly, one of the key benefits here is that it's going to align with payroll and accounting systems easily. And that, of course, has been a key source of a lot of those compliance issues. And it will also simplify payment of annual holidays on termination of employment, which will be a plus for any of you who have had to deal with those slightly finicky sections around the payout of annual leave. What is being proposed is some clear parameters around how this accrual will work. In particular, what we know now is that MB is saying that there will be a minimum accrual rate set of 0.0768 weeks per week of work. And that's going to be irrespective of the number of hours actually worked in a week. The ministry has provided an indication that there will be clarity about the weeks of employment that annual leave is going to accrue during. So it has said right now that the changes will provide for annual leave accruing during any period where an employee is on paid leave, unpaid sick leave, bereavement or family violence, parental or voluntary military service leave, and also when an employee is not working but is away on ACC. The ministry has also gone further to say that annual leave will accrue during the first week of any other period of unpaid leave, but not for weeks beyond that unless there's agreement between the parties. Now, there has been quite a bit of discussion about how the bill that we're expecting to come before us very shortly will define unpaid leave. So there's going to be some clarity around that, we understand, and a formula for determining how annual leave will accrue during that part week, any part week of unpaid leave and during that unpaid leave period. So a few more formulas in there, but hopefully a lot more certainty for employers. There's also going to be a new methodology for determining a week of leave. What is proposed is that the bill will remove the current calendar day aspect for determining the hours that an employee would have worked on a day of annual leave. And we understand that this is going to be replaced with a formula that uses well, we think it's probably going to be based on guaranteed hours in the employment agreement where those are in place. So where an employee has guaranteed hours in their employment agreement, annual leave calculations will be based on those guaranteed hours without a need to look at an audit requirement, a need to look at what is worked beyond that. The interesting point there is that, of course, if somebody has guaranteed hours of work and then works significantly more than those guaranteed hours, what we understand is that the bill won't provide for that in terms of entitlement, but that will hopefully come out in the wash, I think is the thinking here, because that employee will receive a higher amount in terms of payment for the annual leave. So they won't receive a greater entitlement, but they'll get paid more for the time off. the Ministry has also indicated that where there's no guaranteed hours or that can't be determined, there will be some sort of averaging based on the 13 weeks prior to the leave being taken. So that is what is proposed in that space. The Ministry has been quite open that this hasn't been entirely worked through, and so the consultation process that we're going to see on this bill is going to be focused on whether this new methodology for determining a week of leave is going to be practical for the very people using it. So that will be one of the key points that they look for feedback on. I should also note that there's going to be some changes to consequential changes to the cash up section. So essentially you'll still be able to cash up the 1 week of leave, but there'll be some changes to that section to provide for the fact that we're now talking about an accrual system rather than an entitlement system. And there's also been an indication from the Ministry that they're going to clarify the way the pay-as-you-go 8% payment of annual leave, how that works. There's been no definitive suggestion made in the papers thus far as to how that will be done, but the Minister has said that she is committed to making this happen and putting in place a replacement provision that will be simpler and provide clarity and removes any need for judgment in relation to when that pay-as-you-go option can be elected. What I wanted to talk briefly about also in relation to annual leave is, of course, the other aspect, how much an employee is paid for annual leave taken. So in this space, we've had indication from the Ministry that there's going to be a change here, which will be very, very welcome, I suspect, for all of you on the call. I can't tell you today exactly what that's going to look like, but I have some idea. So really, one of the big issues here is the idea of gross earnings, and that has caused a headache, and much more than a headache, quite frankly, because there's been a lot of litigation about it. What's in, what's out? The current act is quite frankly very unclear in this regard. We also have the issue, of course, of ordinary weekly pay, and there being confusion about what is included in that and what is left out. Those key concepts need to be clarified because, of course, you need to know the answers to both of those two questions to understand how, under the current framework, you pay a person for annual leave taken. So what we understand is that there will be a welcome change, and that the annual leave payments under the new legislation will be determined on the basis of being a rate the greater of ordinary weekly leave pay. So there's going to be a new concept introduced there, or quarterly average weekly earnings, or yearly average weekly earnings. So accounting for those dips, those peaks and troughs in gross earnings, but also providing a more stable calculation of ordinary weekly leave pay. Obviously, to determine those final 2 points, the quarterly average weekly earnings and the yearly average weekly earnings, an employer is going to need to look at gross earnings, and the Ministry has promised us a new gross earnings definition to provide some clarity. Unfortunately, we don't know what that will be, but we have been promised a change in this regard. So really a watch this space, but change is coming, and change for the better, I understand. Scott, would you like to talk now about FBAPS entitlements?
Sure, thanks, Hannah. So as you know, the Holidays Act is sort of in two halves. One half annual leave, one half all the other types of leave. As we discussed, it gets shortened to FBAPS, But of course, expanding that out, family violence leave, bereavement leave, alternative holidays, i.e. the extra day off if you work on a public holiday. Public holidays is P, and S is sick leave. So you've got a series of leaves which are all based around days. Obviously, annual leave is based around weeks. FBAPS is based around days. And the government isn't proposing to change that. So it's one of the messages the government is giving in this at this time is we don't want to, as Hannah said, upend the world. You guys are used to FBAPS in days, you're used to annual leave in weeks. We'll work with those. We won't throw those all away. We'll keep those, but we'll hopefully give you greater clarity about all of those things. Of course, the proof is in the pudding there, but that's the basic concept. And so when we get to FBAPS entitlements, the entitlements for family violence, bereavement leave, and sick leave kick in after 6 months. You need 6 months of continuous employment, or 6 months meeting the particular formula under the Act to qualify. The new approach is to say, no, let's get rid of that. Let's begin entitlements the moment you commence work. So for family violence leave and bereavement leave, the intention is that those will kick in straight away, that the moment you begin work. And of course, that makes sense because family violence or bereavement can occur any time in the employment relationship. And getting rid of the qualification means it's available straight away. And of course, you don't have to worry about the 6 month, keeping that 6 month date in mind or holding that 6 month date with respect to these particular entitlements. Having said that, sick leave is a little bit different. The proposal, of course, takes into account that we've moved from 5 days of sick leave to 10 days now. And rather than waiting until the 6th month date to suddenly get 10 days of sick leave, the proposal recognises that, well, number one, employees are giving sick leave in advance. And number two, when you're sick doesn't quite correlate to that 6 month date. And rather than have a hard date, the idea is, or the proposal is at the moment, to spread out the entitlement days, beginning with 2 days when you commence, 4 days after 3 months, the last 4 days at 6 months, that gets you your 10 days. And then a year later, you'll get another 10 days. Now, that's the proposal at the moment. At the moment, it's staggered in the first 6 months, but then as normal, as now, 10 days after that every year. Now, again, that could change, but that's what it is at the moment. And that's something to actually think about, whether we should just keep staggering sick leave entitlements as we go through. Now, connected to that is something the government has sort of not snuck in, but added in a little bit, potentially at the last minute, which is this idea of prorating sick leave. And this is something that employers often raise, this idea that if you're a full-time employee, your entitlement is to 10 days of sick leave after 6 months. If you're a part-time employee, your entitlement is to 10 days of sick leave after 6 months. So you could be working 2 days a week and you get the same entitlement as a person working 5 days a week. Does that make sense? Is that fair? And the government is suggesting that there will be some prorating. In other words, if you're a part-time employee, you don't get 10 days of sick leave. Obviously, that adds complication because you have to work out how the leave should be prorated and apply it to part-time employees. So while it may accord with some people's idea of what's fair, it immediately creates a complexity that doesn't exist right now. So it's an example in these things that everything is a balance. The more specific you make something, the more complicated it gets, the more difficult it might be to apply. The broader you make something, the more universal you make something, the easier it is to apply, but is that fair? So these are all the kind of compromises and balances that are going to go into the Act, the new Act, and that no doubt the government will like feedback about. The government haven't decided to tell us how prorating would work, probably because they haven't worked it out yet. So that's an issue that certainly I think feedback would be welcome, because it would be a potentially difficult problem to work through and make it simple and make it straightforward. One of the other things the government has just said, look, we'll tidy this up, is allowing part days of leave. They haven't again said, can you have 0.4 of a day, 0.6 of a day, or just a half day? But at the present time, the Act doesn't recognise this idea of taking a half day at all. But of course, almost all payroll systems and almost all employers say, of course, if you want to take a half day of sick leave, you've got a doctor's appointment, you're not sick, but you need to go to the doctor for, in terms of an operation or something, half a day, fine, you can do that. But that's not technically recognised under the Act. Again, if you start down this road of allowing half days, you are then allowing a half day to be deducted. You then have to pay a half a day. And that does create complication. So if we think about mentioning payment, it brings us on to the next issue is, okay, you've got a day of sick leave. How should you be paid for that day? At the current time, there are two formula that are available to employers. Most employers use relevant daily pay, and that is what the person would have earned on that day if they'd been at work. For many employers, that makes sense and is actually quite workable, including something like overtime, for instance, where you can work out if all the other employees did overtime that day, that person would have done it as well. And you work out relevant daily pay. In the alternative, that's not possible, practicable, then average daily pay can be used. And average daily pay is gross earnings, i.e. the last year, divided by the number of days worked in that period to create an average. As Hannah was saying earlier, a lot of issues can arise about how you calculate gross earnings. So while that's an averaging formula, you need to get those two components right. What is the gross earnings? What are the days worked? So at the moment, there's that somewhat of a choice for employers between those two, although relevant daily pay is the standard preferred option. Under the new scheme, really it's an attempt to revamp average daily pay, I think. So we're getting rid of the relevant daily pay concept, and we're moving to some sort of averaging requirement, but it kind of smushes together lots of bits and pieces of the current formulas into one new formula. And the government have said these are the bits that will go together to make calculating a day's pay for a day of sick leave, for example. The first is what they've called a base rate for wages or salary. Now, immediately my suspicion levels rise, because immediately I would say, well, how do I get a base rate? How do I work that out? There must be a way. The government hasn't indicated how you work it out, but employees will need to know, how do you begin with a base rate? Because that's the first calculation you'll need to make. But it is a calculation. It's not obvious how you get there. You could do it on a 13-week average. You could do it on a yearly average. You could, what's included in the base rate? Is it just your pay? How do you define salary and wages and that concept. So that sounds good, but immediately I think, well, how do we get there? So as long as the government tells us, sure, but they haven't told us yet, but there will be some sort of base rate. There will be some recognition of fixed allowances. So allowances might be a car allowance or a tool allowance, which will go in. And I think that's on the basis that allowances are sort of paid constantly. So every day you get some element of an allowance for your car or your tools, for instance. And so therefore that should be in relevant daily pay. Sorry, that should be in this new calculation for daily pay, because you sort of are paid every day. So I understand that. Again, we need to work out how we work out what an allowance is. And then an average of productivity or incentive payments. So again, how the average will be worked out, we're not sure. A year, 13 weeks, 4 weeks, we don't know. But there'll be some sort of averaging of an incentive or productivity or bonus payment. Because again, theoretically, on those days you are working, every day you are contributing towards your bonus or your incentive or your productivity payment. So some sort of average will fall in there, and hopefully that will get rid of the idea of working out what a regular productivity or incentive payment is. Then the cash value of board or lodgings, and that's kind of taken from the current requirements which recognise that in relevant daily pay. So the idea behind this one calculation is it would be, according to the government, simpler, easier, more based on averaging, which again is seen as simpler and usually is. But in order to average something, you need a numerator and a denominator. You need something to average, you need a calculation. And so the key issues will be, how do we define this calculation? And in particular, how do we define a base rate of pay? So again, we're looking, that's all ahead of us and is part of the consultation process. Thanks, Hannah.
Sorry, I was a bit click happy with the slides there, Scott. Look, but there's two other changes that we wanted to just give you a heads up on. The ministry's really identified a lot of key niggly points, but two of which are these ones on this slide here. The first being the otherwise working day definition. That is something that I know, looking at the list, I've spoken to a number of you about before. It's a really difficult question, the issue of how to determine when you're looking at whether a person has entitlements to public holidays, alternative holidays, sick leave, bereavement, the FBAPS leave, whether they would otherwise have been working on that day. The current test under our Act really requires judgment. The employer needs to take into account factors, a number of relevant factors that are listed in Section 12 of the Act, things like the employee's work patterns, what the rosters look like, whether there's any reasonable expectation that they'd be working that day. And the current Act doesn't actually provide us with an exhaustive list, it just says all relevant factors. So a really difficult point for those situations where a person is not working a standard 9 to 5 Monday to Friday role. What the ministry has indicated is that the new bill will provide us with a new prescriptive test with clear application for all leave types and working arrangements. Unfortunately, we don't know what that will be. There isn't much more explanation of what that new prescriptive test will look like, but I'm sure once we get the draft bill, we'll have an idea, and that will be a big part of the consultation as well, because the ministry will want to know whether what it is proposing is going to work in practice for all of the different types of employers and employees out there. So a watch the space piece. Another change that we expect to see, another two changes that we expect to see as part of the new bill relate to parental leave. There are two changes here, and the first is that the ministry has indicated that it's going to remove the situation currently where annual leave for returning employees returning from parental leave are paid based on their average weekly earnings for the last 52 weeks. Instead, we understand the new bill is going to make a change to the Parental Leave and Employment Protection Act to state that the normal rules will apply to employees returning from parental or volunteers leave. So they'll get the same entitlements, we understand, as all of the other employees in the workplace. The other change that we're expecting to see in relation to parental leave is that this bill is going to get rid, we understand, of the reference to ordinary weekly pay in the Parental Leave Act. Instead, what the ministry has indicated is that it wants to put in place a single formula, similar to the one that the Inland Revenue currently uses for calculating income estimates. That formula hasn't yet been specified by the ministry in its Holidays Act reform papers, but we're very much expecting that there's going to be a use of a 4-week average based on gross earnings probably, and those 4 weeks being the 4 weeks prior to parental leave beginning. But again, a little bit of a watch this space to understand exactly how that formula will operate. So, with that in mind, we've covered off annual leave, we've done FBAPS, and I've covered off 2 extra points. I suppose what you'll all be thinking now is, well, what happens next? And look, this is a little bit of a different process. What the ministry has indicated is that it's going to be releasing an exposure draft of the new bill. That's a different process than the usual release of a bill and into Parliament and then the standard select committee track. We haven't seen one of these exposure drafts in a while. I think the last one was back in 2019 relating to civil aviation. But the purpose of an exposure draft is to test the effect and unintended consequences of that bill and check that it actually works. And I think that is key here. So probably a really great call from our current government to take this route. So the minister has already called for stakeholders to register their interest in being part of targeted consultation. That registration of interest has already closed, but it looks like the focus will be on that targeted consultation, although part of that will be the bigger industry groups, and so that is where businesses will be able to have their say if they are not being consulted with individually. There, of course, has been already a lot of consultation with payroll providers and the like and practitioners, and that has all, I understand, been fed into the design of this coming bill. And really what we think is that the MB will be focusing particularly on those small businesses to really understand whether this new framework is going to work for them. So that exposure draft is expected in September. I'm not quite sure when in September, but next month. the Minister has then undertaken to provide a Cabinet update in December 2024, and we would expect a new bill to then be introduced into Parliament in the first half of 2025, and then for that to roll out through at the standard readings process after that. What the ministry has then said is that it, at the moment, expects to put in place an 18-month implementation period for most of the changes. So those big key ones like annual leave and FBAPS will certainly have that sort of period of time there. There are some parts of the bill that will come into play much more quickly, in particular those parental leave changes that I just referred to. They're likely to come in before that 18 months elapses, but for everything else, we understand that that will be the period. Now, I can't see all of your faces, so I don't know what you're all thinking there. Interestingly, when the consultation happened earlier, 18 months was very much set as the minimum that most employers would need to roll out the sorts of changes that were being thought about then. So it may well be that a lot of you are still thinking 18 months is going to be tight for us. I know previously there's been indications of employers sort of needing the likes of 30 months to roll out something like this and to have it working smoothly. So really, I guess the message is that you'll want to be keeping across this, across any of the changes, and when that new bill comes out, understanding what is being proposed and any tweaks along the way so that you're best placed when this happens to get implementation underway. Because even though there is a generous period, I understand that for business, that may not be so generous for all of you. Scott, any further comments? Oh, you're on mute. There you are.
Well, but to be fair to the ministry, we've probably been a little bit down on them, giving a bit of a lack of detail. But to be fair, one of the things they are consulting about is 18 months long enough. So one of the things they're specifically asking is, we've tentatively put in 18 months. Is that long enough? So if we think about some takeaways from today, I think the new government's approach is different from the previous government's approach. It does present an opportunity for potential reduction in entitlements for some people. The most obvious one is sick leave. Obviously, the new government has put on the table prorating sick leave, which doesn't happen now. So there may be a situation where individuals are paid less for annual leave or get less annual leave than they would now, and the same with FBAPS leave. We don't know all the details of that, but there has been a shift in the sense that the new government is willing to take a little bit of that on board in order to, it says, get the benefit of simplicity and clarity in the Act. Now, whether that trade-off works in practice remains to be seen, but that's the intention behind this. And there is, in the Cabinet paper, clearly a different thought process has gone into this a little bit. As I said, the focus is on simplicity, removing ambiguity, and allowing compliance. And allowing compliance in a way that's not radically different from the current system, so that hopefully there will be some crossover and people won't be starting again. It is not a big bang, but an evolution. And hopefully the government's view is that it will be an evolution towards a simpler, clearer system, which will be more accurate for everyone involved. And of course, there is the current system, which has a level of inaccuracy, doesn't work for both employers and employees. Doesn't work for employers because they're overpaying, underpaying, have liabilities, can't work out the system. It doesn't work for employees because they're being, in many cases, underpaid right now. And although they may be remediated in 6 years' time, most people would rather get it right now and not wait 6 years for, I don't know, $25 from leave that was got wrong 3 years ago. So it doesn't work for anyone. With that in mind, you know, it is a problem that needs to be tackled, and it's going to be, I think, a bit of a bumpy road in tackling that. Union response to this has been, or public union response to this has been, well, we don't accept it if people's entitlements are going to reduce. No one should have their entitlements reduced as a result of this change. And if we don't get a system that everyone's happy with, all it will mean is that when Labor gets in again, we'll lobby the government for changes back to what it was before, or changing the system again. And so the implicit takeaway from that is that there may be more uncertainty injected if the Holidays Act becomes like the Employment Relations Act. The Employment Relations Act, every time the government changes, you get a series of changes to the Act that last for the term of that government. Government changes, they change it all back again, add some new things, swap it all out again. We all have to readjust. The Holidays Act hasn't really been like that, but the implicit concern is that the Holidays Act will become like that, and therefore, instead of changing the Holidays Act every 30 years or so, or 25 years or so, you'd be changing it every 6 or 9 or 10 years. So there is that concern if there isn't buy-in from everyone involved. So that's a concern to keep in mind as well. The final point there is this is all still in flux. So as Peter said at the very beginning of this, it seems like a long time ago now, if you want to have some input, get in touch with us. We have input and can make representations through the people we know and the organizations we know, but also directly on your behalf if you want. And so there is still time, plenty of time to participate in the process. And hopefully this briefing today has given you a bit of a understanding of where we are right now and where we can go from here. So as Hannah said, keep an eye out for changes, updates, and we'll certainly keep updating through LinkedIn and bulletins and so forth at our end. So everyone can keep up to date with where we are, because this is an important change that is likely to happen. You know, previously it was all a bit pie in the sky. There was 2 years of a task force. It seems like the government is actually going to do something about this next year. So something is happening in this space. So we have to keep an eye on it. There were, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Hannah, do we have any questions that we can slot in the last 5 minutes?
I don't think we do. There was one question just about the accrual rate, but I think that might have come through before I mentioned that. So the ministry is proposing that the accrual rate for annual leave will be 0.0768. That's, I guess, just under that 8% mark, that more exact 0.0768 weeks per week of work. That's what's being proposed right now. And that will be set in the Act as a minimum.
Yeah, and hopefully that will, again, translate into something that can be effectively translated into people's payroll systems. Obviously, a lot of payroll systems have accrual now. This will be sort of more formalizing that system for many employers who already operate that system and give people an idea of their current accruing leave, even though that has no basis in the Holidays Act. So if we can put that on a statutory footing, that should help, I think.
That's right. And then we've just had another question come through, the question of, is there still going to be no ability to contract out of the Holidays Act? And as far as I understand, there's been no mention of that. So therefore, I expect that will remain the case, that you can't contract out.
I expect so too, and we haven't had time to go into all the decisions that were made by the minister in the paper, but part of that is a lot of decisions were made to basically keep the same system. So a lot of decisions were saying, look, these things work okay, i.e. there's confirmation that, for instance, people will continue to accrue leave while on parental leave, for instance, things like that. So it's a series of sort of basic decisions which we haven't talked about today because there's no change. And I assume that's also in that pile, that yes, these are all minimum entitlements and have to be provided to employees. But of course, you can always go above.
Yes, and just another comment that has come through around the arrangements for annual close downs. Yes, look, that is a change that is being made. That requirement to is proposed. That requirement to take annual leave in advance is going to fall away, and so slightly different arrangements there around annual close downs are expected.
Yes, that's one thing to keep an eye out on. I assume we're kind of at the end of the seminar now, and I want to let everyone go and have their lunch.
It's all of the questions anyway, so we're good.
And we'll be providing a link to the recorded seminar, and we'll update you about that after the seminar. So if you want to watch this again, you're very welcome to. And so that will be a resource. And of course, if you've got any concerns, any questions, any comments, welcome to speak to anyone from the team here. And as Peter said, welcoming Hannah back to that team is fantastic news. But get in touch with her, get in touch with me, get in touch with Peter, anyone at the team. And I hope this seminar today has been helpful as we embark on a journey for Holidays Act reform, which is going to continue on for the next wee while.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Hannah.
Yep. Thanks, everyone, and goodbye.
Is it over? Yeah.